always check your children's Halloween candy. Always. I'm not trying to, I'm not saying this to fearmonger, to tell you the truth. I realize that most of the candy handed out on holidays is likely purchased at Walmart the day before and shoved into a plastic pumpkin shaped bowl. You probably have realized that most sane people don't poison candy or put glass in it, or whatever cautionary urban legend you may have heard before. The only guy who did that did so to his own son, so those neighbors of yours, don't treat them like criminals. They're just trying to innocently give the kiddos some sweets. This warning regards a phenomenon that has no apparent origin. What I mean is, no one really is sure of where it comes from. The candy in the question isn't how even so. You can't purchase it at any store, and looking it up online results in no results. The candy, this and aforementioned phenomenon, appears to be that of a cinnamon jawbreaker, not to be confused with the atomic fireball brand or any other similar sweet. It may resemble a red-tinted gumball or a red lollipop with no stick. The point being, it's rather generic in appearance, which makes it tricky to spot the real deal. The candy is sometimes branded under the H.H. Sweets Company, a corporation that doesn't exist. At least not one registered by any agency since 1999. If you search the internet, you may find some H.H. Sweets businesses. But I assure you, they aren't the real deal. Merely a namesake coincidence. If the label carries the HH name, beneath it is a tagline will read something to the effect of hot as hell, sweet as heaven. Not all of the candies sport the branding, but it certainly helps to spot it. This is why I advise you to find yourself or your kids with an unmarked red candy. The safest bet is to throw the sucker away. Documentations of the phenomenon only dates back to 2007, but there is the possibility that it's gone on for far longer. As of this recording, a known 9 people have ingested the candy, 4 of which being children under the age of 18. Each case has happened on October 31st, with the most cases occurring during 2016, with a total of 3 victims. The only clues as to the candy's appearance and branding is through the eyes of witnesses and subsequent investigations of any nearby and opened candy wrappers. Each of the victims' corpses, aside from the heads, remained untouched. The heads, however, are where things get strange. Each of the heads is completely burnt, like a used match. This would make an identification of the victims troublesome, except for the fact that fingerprint analysis lent itself fittingly to the nature of these deaths, considering the hands of the deceased were completely intact. None of the victims were related in any way, with only exceptions being a father and his 9-year-old daughter, Andy and Mary Kay Winfield, from Lexington, Virginia. All the others share no relation other than the aforementioned candy. An eyewitness report from Brevard, North Carolina, documented the full story behind the mysterious death of a 12-year-old boy, Shane Davis, who died on the Halloween of 2009. I was leaving the pharmacy at around 8:30 when it happened. He was walking down the block in a zombie costume. I didn't even notice him at first because it was dark and the costume was dark. But then there was this flash of orange light, like something lighting a candle. I turned around and this heat wave hit me in the face, and the smell. Oh Lord, it smelled like cooked meat. His head was on fire. There were people screaming, but there was nothing that we could do. He screamed only for a moment. He then hit the pavement. I'll never unsee it. There were rumors that it was a hex or from a witch or something. I'm not a superstitious man, but when you see something like that, superstition doesn't seem too far, you know? Similar reports were documented for many of the other victims. Shortly after ingesting the candy, the victim's head would be burst into flames, and soon thereafter the victims would succumb to the injury and die. Many rumors and theories have since popped up surrounding the deaths in the candy. Many include witches and spells, but some have garnered some benefic following beyond the religional folklore. One of the most popular rumors cited the deaths of a result of the 1782 execution of Henry Hyson Cassidy, H.H. Cassidy, a candy maker from Ononcock, Virginia, the site of the first documented death from 2007. Cassidy, a local candy maker, was placed on the trial for disappearances of two young girls from the neighboring town. Despite having no apparent motive for abducting two girls, the candy maker was charged for a reasonable suspect, having access to sweets for alluring the children. Following a local investigation where one of the girls' bodies was discovered with candy in her pocket, Cassidy was charged with murders and sentenced to death. Children from the town who once loved the sweets made by the candy maker being called Cassidy the Witch of Ononcock, making him one of the earliest male witches of the legend. Being found guilty in a hasty trial, Cassidy was sentenced to death by molten metal, a process considered barbaric except in the case of an accused witch. Cassidy, who swore in his innocence until his death, had a molten metal ball dropped into his throat. While in the quick death, it was certainly not painless. The townsfolk remarked that justice was served on that day, and the body was buried in a shallow grave. Given that Andy and Mary Kay Winfield were also from Virginia, many speculated that the spirit of Cassidy might return to punish those responsible for his death. Using his signature candy as a way to torment the descendants of his accuser, the name, too, H.H. Cassidy would explain the name on the wrappers, H.H. Sweets. Another popular theory was usually referred to as the jack-o'-lantern story. Based on the Irish myth, the story goes that a man known as Stingy Jack tricked the devil on multiple occasions, resulting in his banishment from hell, as well as heaven, as he was a trickster at heart. The man was forced to roam the earth, lit coal within a turnip, and has been using it ever since to light his eternal path. The story, clearly rooted in the Halloween traditions of carving jack-o'-lanterns, has been used to explain the candy too. Stingy Jack, as he referred, seeks out to souls to join him in his eternal punishments. The candy, which burns the heads of its consumers, turns them into somewhat crude jack-o'-lantern. This would explain the fiery demise of the victims, as well as the connection to the celebration of Halloween. In conjunctions with the Stingy Jack narrative, there are some who conclude the candy is the work of the devil himself, tormenting the unsuspecting holiday celebrators with the death merely for the fun of it. A rather sick trick, yes, but then again, mischief is a commonplace in the celebration of Halloween. As for this theory, the HH label stands for Hell's Hottest or some other variations of Hell irritation. Despite these varying backstories of the candy, there is a far more grounded explanation that many have subscribed to. Rather than reading into H.H. Sweet's mythology, some conclude that H.H. Sweet's was precisely what it claims to be. A candy company. The motive for committing these crimes is still at large. Still a mystery, but this theory cuts out the claims of ghosts and devils, suggesting that instead of a select few sickos had the willpower to conjure up the sweets with the intent to kill. In the end, no one theory is correct. At least not one could be confirmed by traditional means. A candy that is, for lack of a better term, supernatural could only be explained by the supernatural, making it extremely difficult to verify if any of the information regarding it. If you wish to avoid these grisly results of the candy, it is advised to always check your children's Halloween candy. Better yet, avoid trick-or-treating traditions altogether, or if you're highly concerned, perhaps it would be best to simply skip Halloween altogether. My name is Curtis Banks. I'm an 18-year-old man who's living in the year 2024 in Wisconsin. I remember having one of the worst nightmares I've ever had. This dream involves me being with my school friend Martin Malvo. We joined three men who I knew the names of. One of them, Kenneth Glisp, and the others I'll call Robert Lornwood and Ethan Phelps. But what basically happened? Well, things will go messed up when I tell you this. Me, Martin, and these three men drove to a nightclub and opened fire at a crowd of people. I'm not kidding, I had a dream of me and my friend joining three men to commit a mass shooting. I also had other weird dreams, such as me going inside an empty house while eating ice cream, and another dream I had when I was a very young child. Say back in second grade, I had a dream of me outright murdering one of my classmates, who was, by the way, named Chris. Then I had a dream of me going to a party when I was 13. At that party, I was getting chased by another man with some mask on. And then there was this dream of myself burying a body of me when I was a little child. It wasn't bloody or something like that. Just a body's like how you die from a heart attack or something like that. That was probably one of the most messed up dreams I had, along with the mass shooting dream. I did tell my therapist all these dreams, but they can't go away at all. Yes, I do have unreal dreams of with me with actual cartoon characters as well, but there are nightmares of me that are so surreal for a dream. These dreams weren't okay for me. I couldn't handle them. I couldn't handle it. But did you know that I would get these dreams at the same setting again? Because one day I had a dream of me in a nightclub. It looked very familiar to the nightclub where me and my friend were shooting it up. Because it was. And I was a different person instead of me. What happened, you may ask? The person who I was having a drink. And with her friend. Okay, we were talking and talked about the new Bad Boys for Life film that was going to come out soon. You know what's weird? I had the same dream of me weeks before the movie came out. Something that seems very familiar. But I was back to dancing in the club. And there was even a random kid at the club? What the hell? Who allows children in nightclubs? But I went back to the seats and we saw something horrible. There were these 5 dark silhouettes at the flashing lights. I then heard these popping noises. Shots were fired out and people were gunned down as well. People were eventually screaming. My character was fleeing in terror out of the club. People were running in terror, and what's the part that saddened me the most was the fact that there was a child crying, that the child was crying in the terror while the same shooting happened. I was a different person instead. What was the worst part was I managed to see and remember that the fact that there were dead bodies on the floor. A child crying while hiding. And somebody faking their own death by smearing someone's blood on them. Why? Just why? I woke up and knew it was just a familiar dream. I was a separate individual instead of my body. And what's worse was, I think me and Martin were still the shooters. Same can go with Kenneth, Robert, and Ethan. Then the next night, I had the dream of a separate body in this party. What was going on to happen was I chased this random man chasing a teen to his terror. The body I fought this man and saved the child, which seems like a happy ending to this random unfinished nightmare. The next dream was the other dream I had at school. I was inside another body and I was another person seeing Chris getting straight out murdered. He was stabbed in the back, I think with a knife. Jesus, that was messed up. My questions to these dreams having the same setting as my other ones before is still unknown. But I need to catch a glimpse on how the dream would be like as a different body. Note, I forget what the dreams were from the other ones. But I think that is all I could say. On October 20th, 2003, an Adult Swim bumper was released that disturbed people around 12 o'clock midnight. Accordingly, the bumper was called Gone and was made in 2002, a year before the incident was spread in Cartoon Network studios. The idea of a photo show would be later 12-ounce mouse, later in 2005. The events started when Adult Swim started after an episode of Dexter's Laboratory. The bumper started with a text appearing behind the starry night and what sounded like a male robot saying, "What you're about to see is a recreation of a Halloween bumper made back in 1987, before Adult Swim was even thought about. However, since tonight is the night of frights, we thought we might air the bumper." Suddenly, a deep and demonic voice said, the last part. You have been warned. Static suddenly warped up the screen before it cut to few stills of unnerving scenarios that unraveled like a murder case. Some shows being old or never made. The Gruvenians, a pile of bodies, sat next to a talking tree with ominous silence overtook the scene, with the scene slowly panning out to show the houses, all black and absolutely no colors. Metalocalypse. The band was doing a live show during the apocalypse, but the band succumbed to a zombie apocalypse. Pickles was mauled in the face, Tolkien was bitten in the back before being devoured in the body. William's face was violently torn off, and even Nathan's was pulled back and violently ripped to shreds with the sounds of eating, snarling, and growling. Samurai Jack. Aku was facing a mangled and dead Jack, hung in chains as Aku was menacingly laughing, finally taking the upper hand and defeating Jack once and for all. With the last part showing the same sword Jack was holding stabbed into the body. Jack letting out a pained howl. Space Ghost. Space Ghost was at the same studio where he did the talk show. He mumbled something over before you heard him whisper, "What have you done?" Really, what have you done? Suddenly, the volume extends as Space looks at the camera and screams, "What have you done?" The camera suddenly explodes into static with an AS on the screen, along with the same demon voice saying, "Happy Halloween!" and laughing at the screen snapped to black and stayed there for what felt like 2 hours before quote-unquote home movies suddenly played. Exactly after the complaints started coming in, the creator of the bumper, Dave Willis, who worked on Aqua Team Hunger Force, apologizes for the complaints in Cartoon Network for using the Adult Swim license as a leveraged excuse to make a horrific nightmare scenario, which was said according to Brandon Lively, which was later bashed when learning what PB was introduced, but that's another story. The bumper was stored away in vaults along with the unreleased pilots and canceled shows. It was mentioned in Comic-Con, but it was later changed to Seth MacFarlane's panel was about to start, forever engraving people with the burning screams of the Adult Swim icons. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday. It was the one time of the year you could be anything you wanted to be. You could draw out your darkest desires and display them for the world to see. No one would think you were odd for being the person you always wanted to be. There was no judgment for your choice of attire, and oftentimes you were commended for that choice. Then, at the end of the night, you received a reward for your efforts in the form of a bag full of candy. I am far too old to go door to door begging for treats, but I enjoy watching my children do the same. Weeks in advance, we let them pick their own costumes. They are far too young to delve into the ghastly and usually end up picking a character of a popular movie or TV show. I simply take my pictures and urge them on to each doorway. Always remind them to say trick or treat before the door opens. It has been this way for a few years now, but I am starting to question the tradition, especially after visiting 113 Forest Road. This past year, we made the rounds of our local neighborhood We made sure to only approach homes that had their porch lights on, which was the unspoken rule. Our night had almost come to an end when we reached a home that has been vacant for the last 2 seasons. It was the largest within our neighborhood, towering at 2 stories when all the others only had one level. It was a large brick Victorian monstrosity that may have once been beautiful, but the landscape had long needed work. It was the house that most kids made stories about when we saw the dim glow of that yellow bulb, I was unsure of letting my children approach. My oldest begged to ring the doorbell, and the youngest simply wanted more candy. I was outnumbered and relented at their pleas. My wife sat within the idling vehicle while I followed close behind. The two made their way up the steps, and I waited at the bottom. Like always, I reminded them what to say. My oldest son held his brother's hands and pressed the light button. Ringing, much like church bells, echoed within the house for a moment, before returning to silence. After a few seconds, they turned to me with the questioning looks. I had noticed a moving truck parked outside the home earlier this month and knew someone must have lived there before I had not seen them. There was no car in the driveway, and I did not see any lights on inside. Started to think that they were simply gone and left the light on in case if it was dark by the time they returned. I waved my children to come back to the car and told them that we would just head home. The look of disappointment on their faces told me that they were not ready to end the night just yet. Their faces lit up as the door creaked to life, and a voice beckoned them to wait. "Trick or treat," they both screamed with excitement. A feeling rolled in me like thunder, and a signal of danger rang in my head. Something was not right. If they were home all this time, where was the car I had seen sitting in the driveway last week's? I instinctively advanced my 2 children on taking steps and leaps. A feeling inside told me they should not go towards that voice, and I called them to stop as they turned toward the door. I chose both. The voice seemed strained, like that time of a lifetime smoker. 2 ragged hands shot from the parted pathway and drew both of my little boys inside. Their screams echoed in my head. My Ardeline shot me but my body slammed against a closing door. I pounded repeatedly, screaming obscenities of every nature. My body shook violently as my world became a spiral of despair. The whole scene drew the attention of my wife, and soon she was right behind me. In an effort to find the entry, I took a step back, lifted my right foot, and dropped it at full force into the hardwood. The door frame shattered, allowing the barrier to fly freely into the darkness. I cried out in terror for my little boys to rush as I rushed through each door. My entire reason for living had been snatched up in an instant, and I had been too late to stop it.
When the house had been searched completely with no results, my wife phoned the authorities through the wails of agony. We both held hands. We both held each other until the sirens lit up our tiny neighborhood. It had been a year now, and we still have no answer to what happened to our children. My wife distanced herself from me and assured that she blames me for what happened. I don't fault her for that. I blame myself as well. If I had not let them go to the door or listened to my feelings sooner, they would be still there. Halloween is no longer a time of fun for us, but a reminder of our mistakes. I don't even leave my house on that night, and even the sight of a pumpkin makes tears stream down my face. The drive home from work is especially hard. Witnessing the houses that decorate for the occasion, I am almost in a panic before I close myself within the safety of my home. Please, if you read this, don't let your kids visit 113 Forest Road on Halloween.
Tewksbury, Massachusetts, in the mid 90s was a great place to be a kid. Main Street alone was chock full of kid friendly activities. There was an enormous outside go kart track with a huge arcade full of the best games from the 80s and 90s. I remember spending hours playing the alligator version of Whack a Mole. I loved the sound they made when you hit them. Then, just down the street was Toontown. It wasn't anything special, just a typical 90s music store. But they had the cute little dog with the bandana who'd show up in every commercial. Though, I've long since forgotten the little guy's name. He was really cute, and whenever I go to buy a new cassette tape, he'd be there to greet me at the door. Out of all the places I went to as a kid, Funland was by far the greatest. They had their own go kart track, a small one for the little kids and a larger one for the bigger kids. It wasn't as big or as fancy as the one down the street, but it was still fun. There were batting cages too, lots of them. It even had a small arcade, mostly filled with pinball machines, Pac Man, always the popular Simpsons arcade game. You could never go wrong with that. But the best thing about Funland was the mini golf course. It was the only one in the area at the time, and in the eyes of a 10-year-old kid, the place was huge. The iconic spaceship with the Funland logo sat in the center of the park. You could see it from the street, along with the giant giraffe statue that stared into the parking lot, smiling down as you entered. As were other memorable statuses too, including a pink elephant and a large dollhouse that sat in the back corner. But the greatest part of this entire park was the 18th hole. On the outside, it just looked like a silly outhouse. But if you got a hole on in one, not only you get a free game, but the outhouse door would swing open and you could hear the sound of a toilet flushing, along with the hiss of the hydraulics that moved the animatronics inside. It was just a funny looking dog wearing overalls with one strap hanging down off its shoulders as if he pulled them up. His eyes would blink and his jaw would move and his arms would rise as he scolded you for disturbing him. Hey, what do you think you're doing? Get out of here.
Then the door would close, and you and your friends would have a good laugh before you left. Every time I went there, I couldn't wait to see that dog. Like all things from childhood, the fun of Main Street slowly faded away. I think the go-kart track and arcade were the first to go, sitting abandoned for years before being turned into a daycare center. They kept the track, though. I don't know why. So it just sat there in the back with one or two remaining go-karts frozen in time. Then Toontown went out of business, unable to keep up with the bigger music chains like Newberry Comics and FYE. I imagine that cute little dog has to be dead by now. Last to go, of course, was Funland. It was painful to see it start to rot and decay in its last few years of life. The paint on the animal statues faded, the eyes of a giraffe looking sadly out into the empty parking lot. Lot as less and less visitors came to see it. When the park is officially closed, I was heartbroken. I used to drive by on my way to work, watching it slowly rot away. The elephant eventually tipped over on its side, with the chain around its huge stump of a foot that had been keeping it latched on the ground, now visible and exposed. The doors and the windows of the dollhouse were broken and shattered if it was a real abandoned house. The outhouse door remained closed, the wood cracking with age. I could only imagine what the poor animatronic dog inside looked like. Eventually, nature reclaimed the once thriving park, and I could no longer see into it. All that remained visible was the head of the giraffe, peeking over the rusted fence. Curiosity got the best of me, so I gathered my two friends, Kevin and Zach, one night, and we decided to break in the reminiscence about our childhood. As we walked up to the thigh-high, barbed wire topped fence, I looked up at the giraffe. It was the first time I noticed just how creepy it looked. Its yellow coat of paint had almost completely faded, leaving only its brown spots and huge, almost almond-shaped black eyes. Continuing on, we snuck into the back of the park, nearing the battle cages. Zach had brought the pair of garden shears, and he had cut the fence open, just enough for us to squeeze through. As I entered the park, for the first time, in what must have been over a decade, I looked around in complete awe. I was so excited. Everything was just how I remembered it. The go-karts were still on the tracks. The battling cages still had balls in them. But the arcades was all boarded up, and the mini golf course was covered in trees and was dampened with the overflow with the nearby swamp. I was saddened by the sight of what was once a happy and magical place from my childhood. But seeing it all again made my body shiver in excitement. So did the creepy feeling the old abandoned park gave off at night. I never really noticed it until then. We went through the course in order, starting at the first hole. There was nothing special, just the usual challenging mounds of fake grass. Now moist with rain, the swamp hadn't reached that far yet. As we continued, we walked the past pink elephant, now a shade of ghostly white. He laid on his side, eyes staring vacantly out into the park, as if he had just expired. I ran my fingers over his massive head before moving on. The dollhouse was the next memorable thing we came across. It looked like a miniature haunted house. I half expected the broken doors and windows to be boarded up like the arcade was, but you could still see inside. The little pieces of the furniture were all toppled over and spilled out on the ground. This was the part of the park that where the swamp had begun to creep in. The smell wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. I grew up in Tweaksbury, which was covered with swamps, but we couldn't reach the entire section unless we wanted to wade through the disgusting water. Our only choice was to head straight to the 18th hole. Finally, the part of the park I wanted to see the most, more than anything, I wanted to see that dog again. It was half nostalgia and a half an excitement sort of fear. What would it look like? Was it even still there? Was it in good condition, preserved by the outhouse? Or was it like everything else in the park, sad and neglected after all this time? I couldn't wait to find out. Did you bring it? I asked Kevin. He nodded and handed me one of his dad's golf balls. I held it in my hand, sighing deeply as I ran over my thumb over the grooves. I stepped up to the outhouse and peered underneath. I knew that the hole would be in, and then there was a sudden flash of light, temporarily blinding me. "What the fuck, Zach?" I yelled, blinking away the yellow-white spots in my eye. "I was just trying to help," he replied moodily. "Let's just hurry up and get out of here." "Yeah," added Gavin. "This place is giving me the creeps." "Not until I see him," I snapped. I'm sure I might have sounded crazy. I was talking about the dog as if were a person. He was more than some sideshow attraction to be gawked at. He was a part of my childhood. It was like I was about to meet an old friend who I'd never seen in ages. My friends didn't reply. Zach simply kept his flashlight pointed beneath the outhouse, and Kevin sighed in annoyance, tapping his foot impatiently. But now we could see it all. The hole with the white tube on the ground that would brought the golf balls back into the little hut outside the arcade. It was barely visible over the mound created by the fake turf, but it was still there, and I had a clear shot. I placed the ball on the ground and, aiming carefully, rolled it towards the hole. We could hear the ball enter the pipe, the sound of it swirling down into the ground echoing in the silent park. Zach and I stepped back behind Kevin, the light now shining on the outhouse itself. I clenched my fist in anticipation, wishing with all my heart that it would somehow still work. That the door would open and the dog would still be there. And he would scold me away as always I did. It was a stupid wish. We all jumped at the sun with the sound of once familiar flushing noise, now slightly distorted. Then the doors began to open and a loud hiss of the hydraulics resonated through the night. We stood there breathless and silent. It worked. We actually made it work. After all these years, I'd finally get to see him again. I was so happy that I could feel the sides of my mouth curl up into a magnificent smile, as if I were a child opening a present, but the present wasn't what I was expecting at all. There he stood, my once familiar friend, my reward for getting a hole in one. But I could hardly recognize him. The fur that covered his metal frame was matted and wet, and his overalls hung loose around him, like they would on someone who lost a great deal of weight. My breath caught in my throat, which was now suddenly dry. I swallowed softly, eyes widening as if they traveled up to the dog's face. It was a horrible, hideous sight. The fake fur on the half of his head was torn away, exposing the wires and joint mechanism in his mechanical jaw. I didn't remember him having teeth. On the same side, his plastic eyes had sprung from its socket and now remained dangling by his torn cheek. Then he blinked, the mechanism on the broken eye shuddering around the exposed wire, releasing small sparks. More sparks flew as his arm shot up with a clang, and the hinge of his jaw creaked as his mouth flopped open. He squeaked, "What are you doing here? What do you think you're doing?" The funny southern drawl of his voice was completely gone, replaced by something raspy and angry. And although I could hear the chilling distortion in his voice box, he sounded more human than I ever remembered. Kevin ran. He didn't look back. Zach dropped his phone and slowly backed away, screaming as he stared into the dog's one good eye, which seemed to turn on him at the disturbance. Then somehow the dog moved forward. He wasn't programmed to walk, as far as I knew. The hydraulics attached to his back only sat him up. He wasn't supposed to walk. But my God, I saw that one funny animatronic dog from my childhood step out of the old withered outhouse towards us. I stood there, frozen in fear, staring at it. "Fuck this," I heard Zach utter before. He, too, left me. Now I was alone with, quote-unquote, him. I had spent many years thinking about this very moment. I wasted countless hours thinking about this dog and wanting to see him one last time. But I knew that I should never had stepped foot into the old park. My childhood was dead, as broken as the wires, metal rods that barely held the dog together. He seemed to watch Zach go, his good eye turning with a cracking sound as he watched my friend disappear into the darkness. Then the eye turned on me. "Get out," he commanded, his arm still pointing now in the direction of the parking lot, where the headlights of Zach's car had just turned on. I didn't move. I could still only stare. Was this some sick nightmare? Some bizarre fantasy my brain thought up to get my mind off at time I could no longer return to? The thing stepped closer, its disfigured face mere inched from my own. The smell of wet dog seemed to invade my nostrils. "Get out of here," it boomed, the voice box short-circuiting as if it had exploded before slowly fading out. It sounded like multiple voices had spoken, all deep and aggressive, almost demonic. This time, I listened and ran as fast as I could through the park, which was dimly lit by the headlights of the car. My eyes darted around. The once familiar area now seemed foreign and strange. I couldn't tell where I was going. I heard the sound of children laughing, the trumpeting call of an elephant, and the clanging and grinding of metal gears. When I finally reached the fence, I tried sliding through the hole where we came from, though. But I got stuck on something. I looked down to see if my jacket was caught, but it wasn't. Then I looked back. Staring right into my eyes was one plastic eyeball with a painted-on black pupil. My eyes widened, staring back into the black spot as if it were a hole, ready to swallow me alive. Then I discovered the reason why I was stuck. The hand of the animatronic dog was gripping the back of my collar. I remember thinking that the hand was
was supposed to be stuck in a pointing position. It didn't have any mechanical functions to actually open and close. But then again, the dog wasn't supposed to be walking away. "You shouldn't have come back," I heard it whisper, sending a chill up my spine. Then it released me with a shove, and I fell through the opening in the fence, scrambling to my feet as I ran to Zach's car, not once looking back as he sped off down Main Street. It's been 5 years since that night. I don't talk to Kevin or Zach much anymore, and we never had once spoken of the incident. Not even on the car ride home. I never drove down the stretch of Main Street either until today. It was late, and the road was usually had a detour, which led me right to it. But what harm would driving by do anyway? I thought, but I should have known. I tried not to look. I really did. But I just couldn't help sneaking a peek. I couldn't see much through all the rain, but I noticed the large "For Lease" sign that now hung on the fence. The giraffe was gone, or perhaps it'd fallen over and it was hidden under the thick brush. With a sigh, I continued on, trying to push the memories of that night out of my mind and replace them with the happy ones from my childhood. My windshield began to fog up from the intensive New England weather, so I put my defroster on. Then I noticed something. Instead of clearing the bottom of like it would normally would, my windshield began to clear up in patterns and form words. I stared at them, hoping it was with all hope that it was just a fluke or a fragment of my imagination. But the message was clear. Don't come back. When the police asked what caused me to crash into the pole just outside the abandoned park, all I could do was wrap the blanket they gave me slightly tightly around myself as I stared back towards the bushes and the trees, concealed to the location of the 18th hole. Dog was all I could tell them. It was that dog.